Standing state is the amount of nutrients such as carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus and calcium and other minerals also which are present in soil at any given time. So standing state is the amount of nutrients present in soil at any given time, and we studied one more term in previous classes. There is one more term which is called standing crop. Children, standing crop is the amount of biomass which is present in soil. So never get confused between standing crop and standing state. Standing state is the amount of nutrients present in soil, and standing crop is the amount of biomass which is present in soil. Nutrient cycling. Nutrient cycling, what happens? It movement of nutrients through various components of an ecosystem, that is called nutrient cycling. Like we can see there is sun, which is ultimate source of energy. So solar energy, this is trapped by producers, and then what happens? Producers provide food or nutrients to consumers. There can be different categories of consumers also, like primary consumers, secondary consumers, and then what happens? Tertiary consumers. So there is flow of energy or nutrients from producers to consumers. So there occurs flow of energy from through, that is through various trophic levels. And then what happens? And this is about solar energy. What about gases like CO2? CO2 is fixed by producers, and that forms biomass. And then what happens? This carbon, this goes to consumers, and this CO2 is present in the atmosphere. And then producers and consumers, they both respire, and as a result of respiration they release CO2 back into the atmosphere. So CO2 is coming into this living world by photosynthesis, and it goes back to environment by the process of respiration. So what happens? There occurs movement of nutrient elements through various components of an ecosystem. So this movement is from environment to living world, and from living world to environment. And movement is also through various trophic levels in the living world. So this movement of nutrients is known as nutrient recycling. And what happens? Decomposers also release nutrients back into the soil as a result of decomposition. Nutrient cycles are of two types: gaseous cycles and sedimentary cycle. Let us take example of CO2 cycle. So what happens in case of carbon cycle? This CO2 is taken up by plants by the process of photosynthesis. And then what happens? Plants respire to release, there occurs respiration, and as a result of respiration CO2 goes back to environment. Plants say carbon goes to animals. And then what happens? Animals also respire to release CO2 back into the environment. So what is happening here? Here there is exchange of a gas between non-living environment and living organisms. So in case of gaseous cycle, what happens? There occurs exchange of gas between living world and environment. And in case of sedimentary cycle, what happens? Atmospheric exchange does not take place. We can take example of phosphorus cycle. In case of phosphorus cycle, see, phosphorus is present in soil, and then what happens? Plants take up phosphorus in the form of phosphate ions, और कैसे लेते हैं? In dissolved form. So plants take up phosphorus in the form of phosphate ions from soil in dissolved form, and from plants it goes to animals or consumers. And then what happens? As a result of decomposition, what happens? This phosphorus goes back to soil. So there occurs cycling, nutrient cycling, and here there is no atmospheric exchange. Nutrient goes from soil to living world, and then as a result of decomposition it goes back to soil. So phosphorus is an example of sedimentary cycle. Now let's discuss these points again. Reservoir for gaseous type of nutrient cycling, that is in um, atmosphere. So examples of gaseous cycles are nitrogen and carbon. And then reservoir for sedimentary cycle. Sedimentary cycles are sulfur cycle, phosphorus cycle. So reservoir for sedimentary cycle is earth's crust, soil. And then environmental factors like soil, moisture, pH, temperature, these regulate the rate of release of nutrient into the atmosphere. We all know that decomposition is the process which is dependent on environmental conditions. If there are dry conditions, decomposition is very slow. So when decomposition is slow, rate of release of nutrient into atmosphere, that will also be slow. If temperature is extremely high or extremely low, then decomposition process will be slow and nutrients will be released into atmosphere at a very slow rate. So we can say there are environmental factors which affect the process of decomposition, or we can say rate of release of nutrients back into the atmosphere. And what is the function of reservoir? Reservoir meets the deficit that occurs due to imbalance in the rate of influx and efflux. So what happens beta? There is atmosphere or soil, in case of gaseous cycle it is atmosphere, in case of sedimentary cycle it is soil. And what happens? Then it goes to living world. So there is influx and efflux. So there occurs a balance in influx and efflux. In case there is any imbalance in the rate of influx and efflux, then reservoir, it's kind of storage. So that provides, that meets the deficit which is due to the imbalance of rate of influx and efflux. Carbon cycle. Carbon, let's discuss some of the points. Carbon constitutes 49% of dry weight of organisms. And then out of total global carbon, 71% carbon is found dissolved in ocean. And about 1% is present in the atmosphere. How is carbon fixed? We just discussed it is fixed by photosynthesis. And large amount of carbon is returned to the atmosphere as CO2 through respiration and by decomposition process. Just carbon, it comes to atmosphere, it comes to living world by the process of photosynthesis, and it goes back to environment by the process of respiration and decomposition. And some amount of carbon is lost to sediments, and then it is removed from circulation. What happens? CO2 is found dissolved in water. So in aquatic system there are other minerals also present. So what happens? Carbonates of many minerals like calcium carbonate, magnesium carbonate, there are other salts which are formed, and when they get sedimented they form different types of stones, like limestone is formed. Carbon is also present in calcareous shell. So what happens? These, since these salts are insoluble, they get sedimented and they are removed from circulation, means they are unavailable to the living organisms. So they don't remain available to living organisms. So that is why we say that these are removed from the circulation. And burning wood, forest fire, combustion of organic matter, fossil fuel, volcanic activities, these are other additional sources for release of CO2 into the atmosphere. Now let us see this carbon cycle. This cycle is given in your NCERT also. Now let's see, CO2 is present in the atmosphere. So it is fixed by the process called photosynthesis. So as a result of photosynthesis it comes to plants, and then other small plants, and in aquatic ecosystem also by the process of photosynthesis, there are phytoplanktons which are able to fix carbon dioxide. So phytoplanktons also fix carbon dioxide. So now what happens, it is this carbon is fixed by plants, phytoplanktons and small plants. Now what happens, from plants carbon goes to consumers, and as a result of decay and decomposition, children please make correction in these two arrows. As a result of decomposition, there occurs decomposition as a result of death and decay. What happens, there occurs detritus food chain, which begins from decaying organic matter. So as a result of death and decay, this CO2 goes back to environment. And how does CO2 come to atmosphere? It enters atmosphere, make correction in this arrow also, as a result of burning of fossil fuel, burning of forest, fuel wood and organic debris. What happens, CO2 is released into the atmosphere, and combustion of fossil fuel, that also causes release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And what happens here, as a result of photosynthesis in aquatic ecosystem, biomass is formed in water, and as a result of decay, what happens, and CO2 is released, and some of the CO2 is that is sedimented, that is present in the form calcareous sediments are present, limestone and dolomites are formed. Since they are insoluble, they become unavailable to living organisms. Now let us discuss influence of human activity on carbon cycling. A rapid deforestation is responsible for that is responsible for increased amount of carbon dioxide in atmosphere, because forests have trees which fix carbon dioxide present in the atmosphere. So if trees if there occurs deforestation, excessive deforestation, what will happen, there will be imbalance in the concentration of carbon dioxide, there will be increase in concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then massive burning of fossil fuel, that will also cause increased release of CO2 into the atmosphere, and this increased release of CO2, that will ultimately cause global warming. So major climate change is because of the global warming. And then phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus cycle is an example of a sedimentary cycle because its reservoir is soil. So what happens, now first point is about why is phosphorus required. It is a major constituent of biological membranes, nucleic acids, cellular energy transfer. We know our membranes are made up of phospholipids, or what do we say, our lipid bilayer. So phospholipids, phosphorus is required for making cell membrane. It is important component of nucleic acids and ATP and ADP. Now animals need phosphorus to make shell, bones and teeth. Animals also require phosphorus, and reservoir for phosphorus is the rock or soil. So what happens, that is why it is called sedimentary cycle, and it contains phosphorus in the form of phosphates. So plants take up phosphorus in the form of phosphate ions. So when there occurs weathering of rocks, then phosphates are dissolved in soil solution. There is precipitation also. What happens, phosphate gets dissolved in water, and then in dissolved form this is absorbed by the roots of the plants. Then there are herbivorous animals and other animals. Animals are directly or indirectly dependent on plants. So we can say that phosphorus goes to plants through plants. Plants they give phosphorus to animals, and then as a result of death and decay, what happens, this phosphorus is released back into the soil. Now let us see this phosphorus cycle which is given in your NCERT. See, there is rock, and rock, what happens, as a result of weathering of rocks, phosphorus comes into soil in the form of phosphate ions. and then it is taken up by plants. It is taken up by plants, or if suppose there is raining also, if there occurs rainfall, then what will happen, some of the phosphorus that will get dissolved in water and it will go down to soil horizon, and then what happens, this is called leaching. This is called runoff, and some of the phosphate is taken up by the plants, and from plants phosphorus goes to consumers, and then as a result of decomposition, death of these organisms, what happens, a detritus is formed, and by decomposition phosphorus comes back to soil. And now once again let's discuss how is phosphorus cycle different from carbon cycle. In case of phosphorus cycle, there is no respiratory release, whereas in case of carbon cycle, what happens, as a result of respiration, carbon dioxide is released. So there is respiratory release of carbon but not of phosphorus, and gaseous exchange of phosphorus that between living organisms and environment, that is negligible. living world में आती कैसे है, soil से. So in case of phosphorus cycle, gaseous exchange is negligible. Now let us discuss some of the ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are the products of ecosystem which are free of cost available to us, and since they are available free of cost, we don't we don't value these services. What are let's discuss some of these ecosystem services. A healthy forest ecosystem purifies air and water. It is naturally being done in a healthy ecosystem, and if suppose we buy air purifier or water purifier, it's costly, and a healthy ecosystem that naturally, that free of cost purifies air and water. Then ecosystems, healthy ecosystems, they mitigate droughts and floods. Recycling of nutrients is it's being done in healthy ecosystems. We need not to provide fertilizers to a healthy ecosystem. In a forest ecosystem, we never provide fertilizers, but in a crop field we need to provide fertilizers. So why don't we need to provide fertilizers in forest ecosystem? Because there occurs recycling of nutrients. So there is no need to provide fertilizers in case of forest ecosystem. Then it generates fertile soil. Since there is lot of organic matter, there is and decomposition keeps taking place, conditions become favorable, soil automatically becomes fertile. And in case of crop field, what happens, we grow same type of plants in a crop field. So what happens, they consume all the nutrients from the soil, and then what happens, soil becomes deficient of nutrients. It provides a healthy ecosystem provides wild habitat to wildlife, and it maintains biodiversity. So if there is healthy ecosystem, number of species, variety of species in the ecosystem, that increases. And if we are not taking care of ecosystem, what will happen, there will be extinction of species. And if remember, if one species becomes extinct, then all other species which are dependent on that species, those also become extinct. Then what about pollination? A healthy ecosystem has many insects, birds which help in pollination. So pollination is free of cost, done, no labor is required. And if suppose in a crop field you need to do pollination, what will happen, a lot of hard work is required to get plants pollinated, all plants pollinated. So it is being naturally done in a healthy ecosystem. And then provide ecosystems provide storage site for carbon. So these are some of the ecosystem services.